There's a door in Buckingham Palace that most people will never see, never touch, never stand in front of long enough to understand what it means. It is not grand. It is not gilded. It does not announce itself the way the palace's famous ballrooms do, with their chandelier thunder and their gold leaf ceilings pressing down like the weight of empire. It is a plain door, dark wood, a brass handle worn smooth from decades of the same hand reaching for it, the same palm pressing it open the same way every single morning. Behind that door sat Queen Elizabeth II's private study, and on a cold morning that the palace staff would quietly talk about for years, a woman walked toward it who was not supposed to walk toward it. A woman the institution had tolerated, absorbed, and eventually, after a very long and very complicated reckoning, accepted into its fold. Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, wife of the heir apparent, woman of the second act. She walked toward that door like she had every right in the world. She did not get through it. The sentry stood there, not a ceremonial guard frozen in theater. A real one, trained, positioned, instructed. He had his orders, and his orders did not include her name. He did not move. She waited. He did not move. She waited again. 2 full days would pass before anyone resolved what had quietly become one of the most remarkable standoffs the palace had seen in a generation. Not a war of armies or a fight of words, but a contest of stillness. A woman on one side of a door, a man in uniform on the other, and between them, the unspoken architecture of an institution that had been deciding who belonged and who didn't for 1,000 years. To understand what happened at that door, you have to go further back. Much further. You have to understand what the Queen's private study actually was, not just as a room, but as a concept. Because for Elizabeth, that room was the last purely sovereign space she occupied. Not sovereign in the constitutional sense, though that too. Sovereign in the sense of mine. Only mine. The one place inside the gilded machine of monarchy where the woman and the crown briefly became the same thing without negotiation, without committee, without the endless consultation that royal life demands of every other waking hour. Her red boxes were open there. Her correspondence, the kind that never reached the public record, was written there. She sat in a particular chair. She used a particular lamp. The room smelled like her, not perfume, but paper and leather and something faintly floral that no one could ever quite name. Staff who had worked at the palace for 30 years spoke about being allowed inside, it the way people speak about being permitted into a cathedral after closing time. Hushed, slightly awed, careful where they put their feet. Access to that room was not simply about security clearance. It was about something older and stranger than clearance. It was about the Queen's explicit, personal, spoken consent. A list existed, informal, never published, existing in the institutional memory of the household rather than any written document, of who was permitted through that door without asking first. Camilla was not on that list. This was not an accident. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Camilla Parker Bowles is one of the most carefully managed silences in modern royal history. The official line, by the time of the 2005 marriage to Charles, was acceptance. Tolerance had been upgraded to something resembling warmth, or at least the performance of it. Camilla had been folded into official engagements. She had appeared at family gatherings. She had done the work of making herself palatable to an institution that had, for decades, associated her name with its most public wound. But palatability is not the same as trust, and the Queen's private study was a room for trusted people only. No one had told Camilla this directly. That was not how these things worked. In a palace, you were not told what you were not allowed to do. You were simply expected to already know. The entire grammar of royal protocol was built on this assumption, that the properly socialized person would absorb the boundaries through osmosis, through observation, through the specific quality of silence that fell in certain rooms when certain people entered them. Camilla, perhaps, had not absorbed this particular boundary, or she had, and she had decided on this particular morning that it no longer applied to her. The reason she approached the study that morning was, depending on who you ask, either completely mundane or quietly significant. Some accounts suggest she was carrying something. Papers, a message, something meant for the Queen's attention that she had decided, for reasons of her own, to deliver personally rather than routing through the household staff the way everyone else did. Others suggest she simply wanted to speak with the Queen privately, without the choreographed formality of a scheduled audience, and believed that her position as Charles's wife gave her standing to do so. Both versions lead to the same door. Both versions lead to the same Sentry. His name has never been officially confirmed in any public account, which is itself a very palace thing. The man who held the line remains, appropriately, anonymous. He was a member of the royal household's protection staff, not a ceremonial guard, but the kind of quiet professional whose entire job was to make things not happen, to be the pause before the action, to stand between intention and consequence, and simply, without drama, without raised voice, hold. He had been briefed. The Queen's private study had a protocol. That protocol included a list of names, and the procedure for names not on the list, and the procedure was not complicated. You do not allow entry without explicit instruction from the Queen herself or her private secretary. Camilla arrived at the corridor. She acknowledged him. He acknowledged her back, with the precise degree of courtesy that his training required. Respectful, correct, entirely unmoved. She indicated she wished to enter. He did not step aside. There was no scene, no raised voices, no moment of visible confrontation that a passing footman might have described as heated. The English palace standoff does not work that way. It works in a language of extended polite immobility, of held eye contact, of requests quietly made and quietly not fulfilled. It is a particular form of social violence, the kind that leaves no bruise and draws no witnesses and yet lands harder than a shout. She waited. He did not move. She tried again, not with force, not with argument, but with the tools available to her, her title, her position, her proximity to the heir. She was the Duchess of Cornwall. She was the future queen consort. She was the woman the heir apparent had loved for 30 years and, finally, married and brought into the heart of this family, into this building, into this world. The Sentry understood all of this. He did not move. This was the first hour, and the first hour set the terms for everything that followed. What Camilla did next reveals something about her that the formal record of her public life tends to obscure. She did not escalate. She did not demand to speak with someone more senior. She did not perform the kind of visible indignation that would have forced the incident into official channels, created a report, generated a response. She retreated to a position of waiting. She had the patience, or perhaps the pride, to not make it a crisis. She would wait. And so the standoff became not a confrontation, but a siege. A very quiet, very English siege conducted entirely in a palace corridor, with a woman on one side and a sentry on the other, both of them understanding perfectly what the door meant, what the waiting meant, what the list that did not include her name meant. The palace moved around them the way a river moves around a stone. Footmen passed. Staff went about their days. The ordinary machinery of the household. The meals prepared, the correspondence sorted, the 100 invisible acts that kept the institution running, continued without pause. No one acknowledged the standoff directly. Acknowledging it would have required someone to do something about it. And doing something about it would have required a decision that no one in the household hierarchy was prepared to make unilaterally. The decision, if it was going to come, would have to come from one person. The Queen was in her study. She knew almost certainly what was happening outside it. The household staff communicated in a frequency that visitors and even senior family members rarely intercepted. A glance across a room, a particular word in a particular briefing, a slight adjustment in how information was presented in the morning schedule. The Queen had been reading this frequency for 70 years. She missed very little. That she did not open the door on the first day was a statement, not a cruel one. The Queen was not cruel in her exercise of power. She was precise, but a statement nonetheless. A reaffirmation. A reminder, delivered in the most economical way available, what the private study was and what access to it meant, and who held the right to grant it. The corridor outside that door became, for 2 days, one of the most loaded spaces in the palace. Not because anything visible was happening there, because of everything that wasn't. A woman waiting, a man who would not move, a door that would not open, and behind it, a queen who already knew all three were there. The second morning arrived the way second mornings always do inside institutions built on ceremony, with the same schedule, the same faces in the same positions, the same rituals performed at the same hours, as if the previous day had left no mark at all. Buckingham Palace was particularly skilled at this. Its genius, if genius is the right word for a building, was in its insistence on continuity. On the surface, nothing had changed. The breakfast trays moved. The correspondence arrived. The Queen's Day was arranged in its meticulous sequence of audiences and duties and quiet administrative hours. But the Sentry was still at the door, and Camilla had not forgotten. Inside the palace, certain members of staff had now quietly become aware that something was sitting unresolved in that corridor. Not a crisis, not even an incident in any formal sense, but a tension that the household's instinct for smooth operation was beginning to notice the way a tongue notices a loose tooth. You could not address it directly without escalating it. You could not ignore it without it growing into something harder to dismiss. The palace's formidable middle tier, the private secretaries, the equerries, the household staff who kept the institution's social architecture intact, found themselves in the particular hell of a problem they had not been authorized to solve. The rules were clear. The Sentry had his instructions. Those instructions had not been changed by the Queen's private secretary. They had not been changed by anyone, which meant either no one had told the Queen or the Queen knew and had not moved to change them, and either possibility was, in its own way, complicated. The likelihood, understood by anyone who had spent enough time watching Elizabeth operate, was the second one. The Queen did not miss things. She especially did not miss things happening outside her own study door. Her private secretary, a man trained to present information to her in the most compressed and least alarming form possible, had almost certainly mentioned it. Perhaps not directly, perhaps folded into the morning briefing as a small note, a quiet flag, the kind of understated professional communication that the palace ran on. But mentioned, and she had not acted. This was the most revealing thing about the 2 days. Not Camilla's persistence, though that revealed plenty. Not the Sentry's immovability, though that was its own kind of extraordinary. The most revealing thing was the Queen's stillness on the other side of the door. Because Elizabeth had, in 70 years of ruling, demonstrated repeatedly that when she wanted something resolved, it was resolved. When she wanted access granted, it was granted. When she wanted a situation to end, a word to the right person ended it. She had not said that word. There's a version of this story that frames the Queen as simply unaware or as too occupied with affairs of state to notice a domestic tension in a palace corridor. This version does not survive contact with what anyone who knew her well has said about how she functioned. She was a woman who read documents in full. She remembered names of staff member spouses. She once reportedly corrected a footman's seating arrangement from memory at a formal dinner for 40. The idea that she was unaware of what was happening 15 feet from where she sat every morning is, to put it gently, not credible. She knew. She waited. And in her waiting was a lesson, of the kind the palace had been teaching difficult lessons for centuries. Not with words. Never with words when architecture and time could do the work more permanently. Camilla's position in the royal family by this point was official, legal, and publicly sanctioned. The marriage to Charles had happened. The institution had issued its statement of acceptance. The church had made its accommodation. The titles had been confirmed. On paper, on every piece of paper that mattered, Camilla was where she was supposed to be. But the palace was not paper, and the Queen was not an institution. She was a person, and a person with a particular history with this particular woman, a history that the official statements had smoothed over but not erased, that the public ceremonies had covered but not resolved. What sat between Elizabeth and Camilla was not hatred. That would have been simpler. What sat between them was something more complicated, more royal, more cold. The memory of what the institution had been forced to absorb and the knowledge of what it had cost. Diana's death had cost the palace its certainty. The outpouring of public grief in 1997 had shown the institution something it preferred not to see, that its emotional authority could be challenged by a single human being who made people feel seen. Elizabeth had survived it. She had adapted. She had stood at the gates of Kensington Palace and looked at the sea of flowers and understood, without anyone having to explain it, that something had permanently shifted. She had incorporated that shift. She had moved forward. But moving forward was not the same as forgetting. Camilla represented a specific chapter of what that grief had been about. Not solely. The complexities of Charles and Diana's marriage were never reducible to a single cause. But significantly, the public associated her name with that wound. The Queen had watched the institution manage that association for years, had watched Camilla do the patient, careful work of rehabilitation that royal acceptance required. She had publicly endorsed the marriage. She had issued the statement. She had appeared at events with Camilla present, and had comported herself with the graciousness that the moment required. But the private study was not a public event. The private study was where Elizabeth did not have to be gracious for an audience. It was where she could simply be the woman she was, operating by the rules that she had established for herself, in the one space in that enormous gilded building that she had kept her own. And so the door stayed closed. Camilla, for her part, was not a woman easily reduced to a symbol. The public version of her, the scandal figure of the 90s, the rehabilitated wife of the 2000s, the carefully managed duchess, was like all public versions of royal figures, a compressed and flattened thing. The real Camilla was more textured. She was intelligent. She had genuine warmth, the kind that people who met her in private tended to comment on with a slight note of surprise, as if they'd expected the cartoon and found a person instead. She had survived years of public hostility with a quality that could be called resilience or could be called stubbornness, depending on your sympathies, and had arrived at her late 50s as someone who had finally, after decades of waiting, been allowed to exist in public alongside the man she had built her private life around. She was not naive about the Queen. She knew perfectly well what the study represented. She had spent enough years adjacent to this institution to understand its grammar fluently. The fact that she had walked toward that door anyway suggests one of two things. Either she had concluded that her status had changed enough to warrant the attempt, or she had decided, consciously or not, that the time for absorbing the institution's unspoken signals had passed, and that some things needed to be tested directly. The second day of the standoff brought it to a different register. Word had reached Charles. How it reached him, through what channel, delivered by which member of staff, with what precise degree of carefully calibrated diplomatic language, is not on any record. But it reached him, and Charles's response to it illuminated something important about the impossible position he occupied between the woman he loved and the mother he served, between the future he was building and the institution he was inheriting, between Camilla's dignity and the Queen's sovereign domestic authority over a door in her own building. He did not intervene. This is the part that most people, hearing this story, find surprising. He was the Prince of Wales. He was the heir. He had resources, access, influence. He could have gone to his mother's private secretary. He could have called in a quiet word. He could have found, in the immense diplomatic toolkit that senior royals develop over decades, a way to resolve this that preserved everyone's face and opened the door without anyone having to officially acknowledge that a standoff had occurred. He did not. His decision not to intervene was, in its way, as significant as the Queen's decision not to open the door. Because Charles knew his mother, he understood, better than almost anyone alive, the precision with which she communicated through inaction. He understood that the door being closed was not an oversight or an administrative error to be corrected. He understood what it meant. And he understood that inserting himself, going over the Sentry's head, going around the protocol, Engineering a solution that made the problem go away would not solve anything. It would simply move the lesson from Camilla's experience to his own. It would confirm that he had not understood what his mother was communicating. It would be, in the language of this institution, wrong. So he waited too. 3 people waiting, each in their own way, each for their own reasons, each understanding something the others understood as well, none of them naming it. The palace moved around all of them. The hours moved. The second day moved through its morning and into its afternoon, and the corridor outside the Queen's private study remained what it had been since the morning before, a place where something unresolved was sitting with remarkable patience, waiting for the institution to decide what to do with it. The Queen inside her room continued her day. The red boxes were opened. The correspondence was handled. The schedule proceeded. From outside the door, there was no sound of disruption, no signal that the woman inside was aware of anything unusual in her corridor. The machine ran. It always ran. But late in the afternoon of that second day, something shifted. Not a dramatic shift. Not a door thrown open. Not a voice raised. Not a confrontation finally, surfacing into visibility. Something quieter. A message delivered through the private secretary. A brief communication, the exact wording of which has never been confirmed by any official source, moving from inside the study through the proper channels to the sentry at the door. The message did not apologize for the 2 days. The palace never apologized for anything directly, but it contained, in the palace's compressed and extremely efficient language, a new instruction, one that altered the terms of the corridor, one that moved the sentry, not physically. He remained at his post, as trained, but in the scope of his authorization. Camilla would need to request an audience, through the proper channels, scheduled, formal, the way anyone else did it. The door did not open because she was standing outside it. The door would open when the Queen was ready, in the way the Queen preferred, on the Queen's terms. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was something the palace was very practiced at producing, a resolution that was also a boundary, framed so graciously that the framing itself was the message. You are welcome here, on the right terms, through the right door, at the right time. Camilla received the message, what she felt receiving it, the particular mix of frustration and humiliation and perhaps something grudgingly close to respect that such a message would produce in any intelligent person, is not recorded anywhere. She scheduled the audience, the correct way, through the proper channels, and she waited one more time for the door to open on someone else's clock. The audience was scheduled for a Thursday, not because Thursday held any particular significance in the royal calendar, because Thursday was when the Queen had a gap, a genuine one, not manufactured, not carved out by a private secretary to accommodate a specific request, but an ordinary space in an ordinary week where the machine of monarchy paused long enough to permit something as simple as 2 women sitting in a room together. This was, in itself, a quiet statement. The Queen had not prioritized the meeting. She had fitted it where it fit. She had placed it in the ledger of her week the way she placed every other appointment, by what it was, not by who was asking. Camilla arrived at the scheduled time. The sentry was at the door, as he always was. He stepped aside. This was the entire visible difference between the 48 hours of standoff and the moment it resolved. A man in a uniform moving 2 feet to the left, a door opening, a woman walking through. From the outside, in the physical and literal sense, it looked like nothing. A door opening, a woman walking through. The most ordinary sequence of events in a building full of doors and people walking through them. What it meant was not ordinary at all. The room she walked into was not large. This surprised people who imagined it, who pictured the Queen's private space as some vast throne-adjacent chamber draped in velvet and importance. It was modest by palace standards. A desk, the lamp, bookshelves holding volumes that had been read, not displayed. Their spines showed it, slightly bent, slightly worn, the way books look when someone has actually opened them repeatedly rather than arranged them for effect. Papers were stacked with a precision that was unmistakably personal, the precision of a person who knew exactly where everything was and would notice immediately if anything were moved. The chair by the window was where the queen sat. She was already sitting in it when Camilla entered. This was intentional. The queen did not stand to receive Camilla. She received her from the chair, the way a sovereign receives a visitor, and the positioning communicated everything that needed to be communicated before a word was spoken. This is my room. I am my place in it. You have been permitted to enter. These are not the same thing. What passed between them in that room has never been officially recorded. There are no minutes of the meeting, no correspondence confirming its content, no aide-memoire circulated afterward through the household. The palace, when it wants something to remain private, is extraordinarily effective at ensuring it remains private. What happened behind that door on a Thursday afternoon is known only to the two women who were in it, and one of them is no longer alive to speak. What can be reconstructed from the texture of what came after, from the way the household moved, and the way the relationship between the two women shifted in the months that followed, is a rough shape of what the conversation must have been. Not its words, its architecture. The queen was not the kind of woman who delivered lectures. She did not require that her points be made with speeches. The room itself had already done most of the work. The 2 days in the corridor had done the work. The scheduled audience through proper channels had done the work. The chair by the window and the closed door had done the work. By the time Camilla sat down across from her, the lesson had already been delivered in full. What remained was something else. What remained was the question of what they would build together, or whether they would build anything at all. Elizabeth was, by any serious accounting, a woman of remarkable pragmatism. The emotional life she kept private was, by all evidence, genuine and deep. She grieved, she loved, she formed attachments that lasted decades. But she ran her public life and her institutional life on the motor of pragmatism. She assessed what was real. She accepted what could not be changed. She directed her energy toward what could be managed rather than spending it on what could not. It was this quality, more than any other, that had allowed her to survive a reign of 70 years during which the world had changed almost beyond recognition, while the institution she embodied had to remain, in some essential way, the same. Camilla was now a permanent fact of the institution. She had been accepted. She had been married. She had been given her title, her position, her place in the processional order of events that the palace ran on. She would be queen consort. Eventually, when eventually arrived, that was not in question. It had been decided at the highest levels and ratified by the relevant authorities and announced to the world. But permanence did not mean the terms were yet settled. And the question of what kind of relationship this would actually be behind the official acceptance, beneath the formal ceremonies, in the private reality of two women who had been orbiting the same complicated man for most of their adult lives. Those were not decided by announcements. Those were decided in rooms, quietly, over time, by accumulation of small moments that either built trust or confirmed its absence. The 2 days in the corridor were one kind of moment. The Thursday audience was another. What seems clear from everything that followed is that the Queen chose to use the Thursday meeting to close rather than extend the distance. The lesson had been delivered. The boundary had been demonstrated with sufficient clarity that no one involved could pretend not to understand it. To have used the meeting itself for further demonstration would have been, by Elizabeth's own standards of economy, wasteful. You made your point once, precisely, and then you moved. So she moved. There are people who worked in the household during this period who have spoken in the careful and heavily qualified language that former palace staff use when discussing such things, about a shift that occurred in the dynamic between the Queen and Camilla in the period following this incident. Not a transformation, not a flowering of warmth between two women who had previously been cold. Something more realistic and more interesting than that, a kind of professional settlement. A mutual acknowledgement that they were both going to be in this building, in this institution, in this family for the rest of their lives, and that the only question worth spending energy on was what that would look like functionally. The Queen began, after that Thursday, to occasionally include Camilla in moments that were not required by any protocol or any official obligation. Small things, A brief exchange at a family gathering that went slightly beyond the formally necessary. An acknowledgement at an event that was warmer in tone than pure ceremony demanded. The kind of micro signals that the palace ran on, sent in the opposite direction. Not the closed door and the unmoved sentry, but the slight opening, the slight warmth, the slight indication that the ice had broken enough to permit, if not intimacy, then at least the possibility of it. Camilla, for her part, demonstrated that she had understood. She routed her requests through proper channels. She respected the architecture of the household's communication. She did not again attempt to enter the study without an invitation. Whether this was genuine understanding or strategic adaptation is perhaps a distinction without much practical difference. The effect was the same. The terms were observed. The relationship moved forward. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost when people tell it as a drama about a snub. Because framed purely as a snub, Camilla turned away, Camilla humiliated, Camilla put in her place. The story is satisfying in the way that small social victories are satisfying, for those who were rooting for the queen to maintain her ground, or unsatisfying in the way that small social cruelties are unsatisfying, for those who see it as an unnecessary wound. Either reading misses the thing that makes it genuinely interesting. It was not a snub. It was a negotiation. The most powerful women in England, one the reigning monarch, one the future queen consort, were negotiating the terms of coexistence. Not in a boardroom, not in a formal meeting with minutes taken and positions stated and agreement signed. In the way that powerful institutions have always negotiated the things that matter most. Obliquely, through action rather than declaration, through the positions of bodies in corridors, and the timing of doors opening, and the particular way a woman sits in a chair by a window when someone she has complicated feelings about walks through the door she controls. This is how the palace worked. This is how it had always worked. And both women understood it, which is why the standoff was possible, because you can only have a standoff of this kind between two people who speak the same language. If Camilla had not understood the grammar of what the closed door meant, the standoff would have simply been a misunderstanding. It would have been resolved with a polite administrative correction and a brief apology and a door opened without significance. Instead, it lasted 2 days because both women understood exactly what was happening and both were willing to hold their position within it. The Sentry, in this reading, was not a man refusing entry to a duchess. He was the instrument of a conversation between two queens, one current, one eventual, conducted at a remove, through protocol and patience and the language of institutional architecture. He stood there and did not move because the woman inside the room needed him not to move, and he understood his role, and he fulfilled it for 48 hours with the professional stillness that his training demanded. He has never been publicly identified. He has never spoken about it. Somewhere, presumably, he knows what he held the line on. He knows that the door he stood in front of for 2 days was not simply wood and brass and hinges. He knows that the woman who waited on one side and the woman who sat on the other were conducting something between them that required him to be exactly as immovable as he was, for exactly as long as he was, for reasons that went far beyond any written protocol. He held. They waited. The door eventually opened. What happened next? The gradual thaw, the professional settlement, the long and complicated process by which Camilla found her footing in the institution and Elizabeth found a way to coexist with the fact of her, took years. It was never simple. It was never the story of two women who resolved their history and emerged from it as friends, because that was neither realistic nor necessary. It was the story of two women who both understood the institution they were operating inside, who both understood the cost of permanent warfare within it, and who both chose, for reasons that were partly pragmatic and partly something harder to name, to find a version of peace that the palace's particular logic allowed. The private study remained Elizabeth's. Until the end, it was hers. The list of people permitted inside without asking first remained the list it had always been, small, specific, and unchanged by the incident in the corridor. But Camilla had an open invitation after that Thursday, not to enter at will, not on her own terms, on the Queen's terms, through the proper channels, scheduled in advance. For two women in that institution, with that history at that moment in time, that was something close to remarkable. The door had opened. Not all the way, but enough. And sometimes in palaces, as in most things, enough is what you get. And the wisdom is in recognizing it for what it is, not a defeat, not a victory, but the beginning of something that might, with enough patience and enough time, become something neither woman had expected when they began their long and loaded negotiation at a plain dark door with a brass handle, worn smooth from the same hand reaching for it every morning for 70 years. Not Camilla's hand. Never that. But perhaps if things went the right way over the years to come, the hand of someone who had earned the right to be in that corridor without needing to be told where to stand. The Sentry, somewhere, still does not speak about it. The room, if rooms can hold things, holds it still.